Speaker, I started a while ago during the presentation of the budget of the DOE, and considering that some issues are interconnected, more particularly in the price of electricity, that is a perennial and recurring problem to most of our constituents, if not all. Earlier, I made reference to Republic Act 9209. This is the franchise of Meralco. Mr. Speaker, Your Honor, under Section 4 of this franchise, the grantee for Meralco shall supply electricity to its captive market in the least cost manner. Also, under the same section, the grantee or Meralco shall charge reasonable, just, and competitive power rates. So this descriptive or modifier of the price of electricity, least cost manner, reasonable, just, and competitive power rates. It has to be processed, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor, because ordinary consumers will not be able to understand how it is operationalized. Why would, for example, the franchise would talk about reasonable price, just and competitive price of electricity, when in reality, the consumers are confronted with the difficulty of being able to pay their monthly bills? How can we rationalize this, Mr. Speaker, Your Honor?
Mr. Speaker, Your Honor, this distinguished gentleman from Sagip asking how the ERC is fulfilling their mandate in making sure that the concerns of the citizens are met and that the prices of electricity and power, for that matter, are just and reliable. Is that the question, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker?
The question, Mr. Speaker, Your Honor, will probably fall on the responsibility of ERC to operationalize this, because it appears in the franchise of one of the biggest distributor or distributor utility, which is Meralco. I'd like to believe, Mr. Speaker, Your Honor, that reasonable, just, competitive, and least cost manner can only be justified if the regulator will work on the very foundations of this section under Republic Act 9209. Otherwise, it will only be a matter of provision, because, as I said, the consumers are confronted with the actual difficulty of being able to pay their monthly bills. But we cannot say that they are reasonable. We cannot say they are just and competitive, because consumers continue to complain on the increasing price of electricity. That is why I'd like to find rationalization. I think we should rationalize. I think we have to harmonize the provision of their franchise with the realities on the ground. We cannot keep our eyes open amidst the complaints of people, particularly today, when the pandemic has affected our economy and their ability to continue with their lives. Mr. Speaker, Your Honor. This is the main point. How can we explain to them that under the franchise of Meralco, it is happening? Because there is a clause here, Sir Speaker, Your Honor, that under the terms of its franchise, under Section 9, I will read, this franchise shall be for a term of 25 years from the date of the effectivity of this act. By the way, Mr. Speaker, I think the franchise of Meralco was approved in 2003. And so it has up to 2028. It says here, unless sooner revoked or canceled by Congress for any violation of the term and or condition of the franchise herein granted. One of the conditions, one of the provisions, Mr. Speaker, Your Honor, is to keep the price reasonable, just, competitive, and they are produced in the least cost manner. That this is not happening. It seems to me there is a violation. And considering that under this section, any violation can prod Congress to probably revoke or cancel the franchise. I do not wish to insinuate anything, Mr. Speaker, Your Honor. I am only trying to point out the clear provision of this franchise. And ERC, I think, is in a position to rationalize this and explain to our people how come in your power there is this distribution utility, Meralco, there is an approved franchise, you are the regulator. How come this condition is not happening? How come this condition is not felt by our people?
Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, I agree fully with the gentleman from Sagip that ERC mandate is to make sure that the price of electricity and power for that matter, in any case which may be, must be reasonably priced, reliable, and sustainable. It must be just. That's why the ERC, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, has a system of constant evaluation wherein they engage the consumers. For example, let us not just talk about Meralco because I don't want to specify their policy. But in any distribution utility, the ERC must conduct a regular evaluation, which they do. In any rate application, they must engage the consumer, and the ERC must be fully engaged with the whole system of the distribution utilities and the power generations. So they will check where the problem will come from. The sponsor, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, agrees fully with the distinguished Deputy Speaker.
But the problem remains, Mr. Speaker, Your Honor. I think the Energy Regulatory Commission miserably failed in being able to explain to our people by way of, let's say, comparison. How do we say that the price that they pay today is reasonable? How can you convince the ordinary consumers that the price that they pay monthly is just and it is competitive?
Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, all the prices are always not just for me. As far as the sponsor is concerned of the ERC, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, for me, there's no just price. It's always very high for the consumers. That is very unfortunate. That's why the ERC must work harder and faster to make sure that the consumers feel good when they pay for the electricity they use, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, Your Honor, the consumer will feel good only if the ERC is able to explain adequately, honestly, truthfully, and openly that the price is competitive. But how would ERC be able to explain that it is competitive. It's very easy, Mr. Speaker, Your Honor, to say that the price is competitive. Ganito po yan eh. Di po natin pwedeng sabihin, ito maganda. Ang maganda po ay pwede nating i-conclude kung merong makomparison. Ito maganda siya talaga kung ikukumpara mo kay ganito. So, competitive is relative. Just is relative. Reasonable is relative. It has to relate to something so that people will be convinced that the monthly bill that they pay is the one that has been institutionalized, that has been placed
Your Honor,
under the franchise of Meralco. This is the whole problem here, Mr. Speaker.
Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, the ERC conducts regular consultations and public consultations with the consumers to the best of their abilities. Of course, it's not enough. Nothing is ever enough, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, as long as we are having a hard time in paying for the electricity. Nothing is ever enough, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker. I admit that. But let us allow ERC to at least try to fulfill their mandate. Is it
Mr.
enough?
Speaker.
It's not enough. When it will be enough, it will never be enough. Because we, the consumers, will always complain about what we pay for. And I agree with that because I myself complain for what I pay for, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, Your Honor, I hope I will not be belaboring this issue. But ordinary people, like the constituencies of this representation, need to know what is RORB, what is PBR, what is price competitive power supply contracting, what is feed-in tariff, what do you mean by retail competition and open access system, or why do consumers have to pay the tax on the standard debts of the National Power Corporation, or at the very least you have to explain the net metering program for renewable energy. Ordinary consumers do not understand all this, Mr. Speaker. You can only relate to them. ERC will become relevant to them if they feel that what they pay is competitive, what they pay is just, what they pay is reasonable.
Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, we should implore the ERC to expand their consultations and their dialogues with the people whom they are sworn to serve, whom they are mandated to protect. Perhaps after this pandemic is over, when big gatherings can be done, perhaps they can do this in a more exhaustive manner. The gentleman from Sagip is correct, and the sponsor agrees with him. The ERC should find a more exhaustive way of explaining to the people what are these terms.
Thank you for that answer. Let's go to that process. Can ERC at the very least explain to us the process of consulting with the people? How do they do this? For example, Meralco would apply for a new rate. ERC would study the rate being presented by Meralco. They call for public hearing. Would the people understand the algebraic and mathematical equation behind the power rate application of Meralco? They would not be able to understand. I ask them because they will give you at least several compendiums 6 inches thick. That is the equation, that is the formula. I don't think even the commissioners of ERC will be able to explain or understand the complications behind those numbers. So how would the consultation be practical if members of Congress will not be able to understand those mathematical computations because they are not only complicated?
Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, this industry is really very complicated. That I must admit. But the ERC, again, is trying their best. We're not saying it's enough. They should try further. But for now, basically, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, when there's a rate application, it is published in the newspaper even before it is accepted. And then there's dialogue with the consumers. Is it enough? It's not enough. Should they do more? They should. Can everybody understand these numbers, these terms? No. Even members of Congress, professors in universities, they can't understand these things. Indeed, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, the power industry is very, very complicated.
That is the problem, Mr. Speaker, Your Honor. It is complicated. They made this complicated for people not to be able to understand it. Mr. Speaker, Your Honor, the first element of due process is to inform. If ERC fails in the basic element of informing the people how the rate is fixed, there is no due process. If the chairperson or even the commissioners of ERC will not be able to understand the mathematical computation behind these rates, there will be no due process. With more reason, that our consumers will not be able to understand. That is why, until today, we're still approximating what is conservative, what is competitive, what is reasonable, what is just. It is in the franchise of Meralco. Somebody should explain to our ordinary people that what they pay is reasonable.
Your Honor,
I think
Mr.
they gain
Speaker.
the right, Mr. Speaker, to be able to know that what they pay is what was written in the franchise of Meralco.
Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, we have been dwelling in this issue for the past 10 minutes. The sponsor agrees with the gentleman, the distinguished Deputy Speaker. But as I said, the power industry is really a very technical and complicated industry. It is hard to explain to our people. Even members of Congress, technocrats, they can understand everything. What more? Our constituents who unfortunately did not even finish high school. Perhaps the gentleman from Sagip can propose some ideas. That he can write the ERC some ideas on how they can exhaustively explain to the consumers whom they have sworn to protect some ways and means on how to engage the consumers more exhaustively. Because how the ERC engages the consumers apparently is not enough.
Gusto ko yan, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor. Katulad po halimbawa ng system loss na matagal po nating pinag-uusapan. Dalawa po kasi ang klase ng system loss, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor. Ang sinasabi nila, isang technical, isang non-technical. Gusto ko pong tulungan ng ERC na magpaliwanag sa aming mga constituents. Pero, tatapatin ko kayo, kahit ako po, parang lumalaban ang kalooban ko na ipaliwanag ng ganon sapagkat parang napakahirap intindihin. Halimbawa po, nakalagay po dun sa non-technical factors ng system loss. Halimbawa po, nasira yung metro. Hindi po kasalanan ng consumer yun. Ang metro po, pag-aari po ng Meralco. Yung pong kanyang bookkeeper, nagkamali ng kakukwenta. Yung accountant po niya, nagkamali ng filing. Yung pagkakamali po na yon, babayaran ng consumer as system loss. Paano ko pong ipaliliwanag yun? Yung pong natural causes, halimbawa po, nabalatan yung kuryente, yung heat, at saka yung, talagang ganun, merong nadidissipate na kuryente. Magmula dun sa power generation to transmission until the distribution to the households. Meron po talaga eh. But I think the distribution utility knows it perfectly na ito po talaga ang sistema ng kanyang negosyo. Alam niya, bago pa siya nagpasya, na pumunta sa ganitong negosyo, alam niya merong loss. Alam niya merong mawawala. Parang yelo po yun eh. Bago mo po, pagkabili mo po sa planta ng ice plant, at dadalin mo po doon sa nagtitinda ng halo-halo, meron pong natutunaw talaga doon eh. Yun yung loss. Pero alam po nung gumagawa ng halo-halo, kapag kabili niya, pagdating niya doon sa kanyang pagawaan, bawas na yon. Pero hindi niya po i-charge doon sa bumibili ng halo-halo sapagkat parte na po nung kanyang risk. Every business
Tama po, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
must
Dapat
accept
po,
the element of risks.
tama po, ang negosyante dapat,
Hindi po,
they should
ganito
be the
po
ones
kasi,
who would take the
ang
loss,
sabi
not the
ninyo,
consumers.
kailangan mag-propose ako. Sana yung system loss, huwag na po natin ipabayad sa kanila. Wala naman po silang kasalanan dun eh. Either natural cause, either man-made. Yun po yung risk ng isang negosyo. Mas madali pong ipaliwanag na kayo na po ang magbayad nun. Wag na po yung consumer. Isa pa po, bakit po yung sa government tax? Nagbayad na po siya ng generation charge. Bakit po yung tax ng generation charge? Bakit po yung consumer ang magbabayad? Nagbayad po siya ng transmission tax. Bakit po nagbayad po siya ng transmission charge? Bakit po naman yung tax ng charge na yon, ba't consumer pa po ang magbabayad? Nagbayad po siya ng distribution charge. Bakit po yung tax ng distribution, ba't consumer pa magbabayad? Bakit? May I ask categorically, is it clearly provided under the law na yung magbabayad lang po ba nung tax na yon, yung consumer lang, wala po bang babalikatin yung generation, yung transmission, at saka yung distribution? Tanging-tangi po bang ang consumer lang ang babalikat nung cost na yon?
Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, alam nyo, lahat po ng sinabi nyo, ako yung sumasang-ayon. Kailangan po yung mga ganun, kunyari, assuming, sinabi nyo po, yung metro ng kuryente. Sino man pag-may-ari niyan? Yung distribution utility. Kung masisira nga naman po, ba't may charge sa consumer? Diba? Hanbawa po, ang...
Yun po yung tinatanong ko sa inyo.
Oo nga po, ako yung sumasang-ayon sa inyo. Patapusin ko naman po ako. Kaya ang problema po, the law prevents that. Perhaps we can repeal the law, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker. Ang sabi po nila, yung mga tax naman po, lahat po sila ay sumusunod sa mga BIR circular po. Anyway, the BIR naman po, their budget got deferred. Perhaps we can ask them together when they come here next week.
Meron po akong simpleng suggestion, Mr. Speaker, Your Honor, para matapos na lang ako. At ito po ay simpleng-simple. Halimbawa,
Opo.
kakausapin ko po si Congressman S. Barber. Nag-file na po siya ng bill. Alisin na po natin yung VAT na merong charge sa distribution, manggagaling pa yung VAT doon, ang magbabayad consumer. Alisin po natin ang system loss. Pagkatapos, ang ERC, kakausapin po niyang Meralco, wag na siyang kokontra. Wag na po siyang makikipag-usap dito sa Congress. Kakasangkapanin niyo yung marami sa amin para i-block po yung bill ni Congressman Barber. Kasi po, sa debate pa lang, baka matalo na po si Congressman Barber sa laki ng kalaban niya. Pero kung halimbawa, makikipag-cooperate, nasa usapan lang naman po ito Mr. Speaker, Your Honor. Halimbawa, pumayag ang Meralco, sige, hindi na kami kokontra dyan. Hindi na kami maglalabi. Hindi na kami pupunta sa Senado. Basta kung ano yung bill ni Congressman Barbers, kung gusto nyo isang araw, third reading ka agad yan. Wala tayong problema sapagkat inalis natin yung impediment na nakalagay sa batas. Pwede po ba tumulong ang ERC na, let us persuade Meralco? Ito lang ang paraan po para maramdaman naman po ng consumer, Mr. Speaker, Your Honor. Matagal na pong panahon.
Pwede na po sumagot.
Sana po kanya, may baba natin ng kahit konti lang. Ang laking bagay po noon. Alam po ba ninyo, kanya yung 50 pesos hanggang 100 piso monthly na matitipid namin. Napakalaking bagay na po sa amin noon Pero kung ibababa po ng Meralco, 1% lang po nung system loss, ang katapat nun po, 7 sentimos lang, Mr. Speaker, Your Honor. Parang wala ring mararamdaman ng consumer.
Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, tama po yung sinabi nyo, minimum kahirin po ng ERC yan. Ang problema nga po, sila, ang kanilang kami po, nakatali sa batas. Pero sila po, pumapayag po, tutulong po sila sa atin na they will support that law na ating mungkahi na ang batas ay i-repeal po natin. Now, the lobbyists who will come here, will go to the Senate. Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, I cannot speak for them. I cannot commit that they will not do it. But of course, we will fight them as long as we serve the people and what is good for the people, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
Ito po, huli na lamang po, Mr. Speaker. Salamat po doon sa pagtanggap nyo ng mungkahi na yon. Sama lang,
Your Honor, Mr. Speaker,
natin ang ERC.
yung mungkahi po na yun ay tinatanggap rin ng ERC, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
Salamat po.
They are the same page as the distinguished Deputy Speaker.
Ito po yung naging problema po ng pangkaraniwang mamamayan ng itong nakaraang pandemic. Palagay ko po lahat tayo nito ay nagkaroon ng problema tungkol dito. Dahil nga po hindi ginamit ang metro, ang sabi ng Meralco, nakipagsumpo sa akin Mabuti naman ako'y nagpapasalamat at sa pagpapaliwanag nila, ginamit pa nila ang Zoom. Pero ako po'y nagigiltihan, sana man lang sa bawat mamamayan, isum nila. Hindi lamang dahil ako po ay kasama sa Congress. Pero doon sa pagpapaliwanag po nila, hindi ko pa rin maintindihan yung karamihan. Halimbawa po, ang bill period po, ng January 19, 2020 to February 18, 2020, kinuwenta ko po yung price per kilowatt, 10 pesos and 34 centavos. Yung sumunod na billing period po, naging 21 pesos and 41 centavos. Hindi ko po maintindihan yung bakit pa iba-iba. Sumunod po, naging 7 pesos and 40 centavos. Sumunod na naman po, 9 pesos and 96, kahuli-hulihan po, lumundag uli, 22 pesos and 50 centavos per kilowatt. Hindi ko po maintindihan yon. Kung ako po, na membro na ng Kongreso, hindi ko kayang intindihin bakit palundag-lundag. Sa kanila naman po galing ito Hindi po nila maipaliwanag na mabuti ito. Ngayon, kaya po nananatili yung problema, kakulangan po ng komunikasyon mula sa ERC, kung paano ipaliliwanag sa tao talaga, unang-una kailangan po maramdaman nila. Alam po natin ang gawain ng ERC, regulator po kayo. Ang problema lang, sa pagre-regulate natin, kinakailangan po kasi ang transparency. Paano magkakaroon ng transparency kung yung mathematical and algebraic equation na kung saan finifix ang rate, wala pong nakakaintindi. Paano po magiging transparent kung isa man sa atin, hindi natin kayang intindihin kung paano kinukwenta yung rates? Ito po yung pinaka-problema, Mr. Speaker, Your Honor. At ako po yung nagpapasalamat at sana ay naiparating nating mabuti sa ERC kung ano po yung damdamin ng karaniwang tao na hanggang ngayon po ay naghahanap ng katwiran. Gusto lang naman nilang maipaliwanag mabuti. Ito po binabayaran ko, ito na po ba talaga yung ultimo? Ito po ba yung nakasaad talaga doon sa prangkisa ng Meralco? Palagay ko, pag naipaliwanag natin, baka yung nagsisikip po niyang kalooban, baka naman mabawasan. Tsaka walang po ng paliwanag, kaya lalo pong nahahapis na kanya yung puso niya, pati bulsa niya nahahapis. Pandemic po, kaya nanlulumo po ang ordinaryong consumer. Sir Speaker, salamat po sa inyong panahon na ibinigay. Sir Sponsor, salamat at tinanggap nyo yung mga mungkahi. Sana naman sa lalong madaling panahon makagawa tayo ng paraan kahit na kinakailangan natin siguro ng milagro